Ministers at War by Jonathan Schneer continued. Disc 9. In February 1943, the Labour ministers had acquiesced grudgingly in the decision on the Beveridge report forced by Wood and Churchill. There would be no rulings about reconstruction until the end of the war, when Britain's financial situation would be clear. Morrison had sold this to Labour MPs in his famous speech in Parliament during the Beveridge debate, by emphasising that the government would make decisions as soon as it could, but he cannot have liked doing so. In May, he wrote a paper entitled The Need for Decisions that revisited this fraught subject. In early June, Attlee and Bevan reworked the paper, and the three men, a potent combination whenever they managed to cooperate, discussed it. On June 26, they submitted a powerful memo to the War Cabinet calling for a complete revision of the government's position. They wanted it to make now the best forecast it can of the financial and economic position of the country after the war, and on that basis to take a major decision as to the items which is prepared to carry through into law before the end of the war. They listed the items they thought should be considered: the use of land, development rights, compensation, water supply, the financing of the building program, and the reorganization of transport, heat and power. Also, they wanted information on the budgetary implications of post-war reforms in such areas as social security, education, agriculture, full employment, the future of domestic industry, export trade, health and colonial policy. Official plans are not enough, they argued, nor is the taking of decisions upon them in principle. We urge, therefore, the taking of early decisions on reconstruction planning intended for wartime legislative implementation where necessary. Churchill sent the paper to Wood for comment. The Chancellor did not like it. His reply detailed the many times and ways in which government ministers, including most obviously the Prime Minister, but also Morrison himself during the Beveridge debate, had stated that decisions could not yet be made. But he provided no new justification for postponing them. The Prime Minister sent Wood's memo to Attlee, who returned an acid reply. I have read with interest the observations of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which seem to me to beg the question we have posed. I shall welcome an early discussion. It did not take place. Churchill had set off for Quebec. 6 weeks later, with Churchill again absent, Morrison wrote in frustration to his party leader. I appreciate the Prime Minister's intense preoccupation with other matters, but I really do not think the discussion of the broad question of principle involved in our paper ought to stand over for very much longer. But it did stand over for the rest of the summer and on into the fall. During this period, Kingsley Wood died suddenly and unexpectedly, and Churchill, briefly back in England, appointed the Lord President, Sir John Anderson, to replace him as Chancellor. Attlee would then replace Anderson. The little man would be no loss, Eden noted unkindly of Wood in his diary. But perhaps Churchill would miss him. He had lost his strongest ally in the fight against early implementation of Beveridge's proposals. Churchill finally found time to write a response to Attlee in late October. Perhaps Wood's absence was taking a toll on him, but so was the continuing leftward swing in the country as a whole. One indication: at almost every by-election, the newly formed socialist group, Commonwealth, gathered strength, although every party in the coalition, and the communists besides, opposed the group. Its by-election candidates almost always polled respectably. Commonwealth won victories in 3 constituencies, ousting a National Liberal and 2 Conservatives in the process. Of the 2 other Commonwealth MPs, one had left the Liberal Party, and the other had previously been an independent. Needless to say, the organisation favoured swift implementation of Beveridge's proposals, and much more. Churchill felt impelled to cede further ground, Any decisions which are needed for the supreme objects of food and employment in the years immediately after the war must be taken now, he admitted, whether they involve legislation and whether they are controversial or not. When the War Cabinet met to discuss Churchill's response to the Labour paper, the Prime Minister surrounded himself with his party's heaviest hitters: Beaverbrook, Butler, Anderson, Littleton, the former businessman whom Churchill had first appointed as Minister of State in Cairo and then as Minister of Production, and Frederick Lindeman, Lord Cherwell, his confidant and scientific adviser, whom he had made Paymaster General. But Labour put up a strong team too, including Attlee, Bevan, Morrison, Cripps and Dalton, Minister of Economic Warfare and Chief of the Special Operations Executive. Everyone knew already that the left had the wind at its back. In the end, all the Conservatives agreed to Churchill's concession. Perhaps they thought it would be sufficient to stem the left-flowing tide. Yet Morrison pressed for more, broaching indirectly the possibility of nationalising certain industries. He said he hoped the government would not be precluded from considering such changes in the organisation of particular industries as would increase their efficiency and thus enable them to provide fuller and more continuous opportunities of employment. He then said he would like the Prime Minister to consider certain suggestions which he would send to him for modifying some passages in his memorandum in order to meet these 2 points. This seems almost too cheeky, but the Labour ministers knew they had public support. 2 days later, Morrison was crowing to the editor of the Manchester Guardian. The PM is willing now to admit that there must be certain practical measures to be taken in good time. During the final year and a half of the war, Labour would continue to advance and the Conservatives to retreat. Given the country's mood, they could do no less. It was shortly after the meeting on decisions that Churchill appointed Woolton to head the new Ministry of Reconstruction. The establishment of such a department marked yet another concession in and of itself. There followed a series of famous white papers on health, employment, town planning, land use and more, all of them surrendering further ground to Labour's position. Another notable example of ground ceded was the Prime Minister's apparent conversion to the Keynesian doctrine of counter-cyclical spending during periods of economic slump. What is proposed for public authorities, the Prime Minister explained in May 1944 to his colleagues, as if a light bulb had just been lit in his brain, is the exact opposite of what would generally be done by private persons. When things look bad, they should not draw in their horns, but push them out and launch forth into all sorts of new expenditure. But he cannot have liked it. In a January 1945 letter to Attlee, Churchill, testifying to the great weight Labour now wielded in his government, observed that a solid mass of 4 socialist politicians, Attlee, Bevan, Morrison, Cripps, of the highest quality and authority, 3 of whom are in the War Cabinet, exercises a dominating force. But he never sent the letter, in part perhaps because for all that Labour continued to advance, it did not really dominate. So long as the war lasted, Labour ministers, including even Morrison, feared pushing too hard for anything, lest they provoke a general election they were sure they would lose. For all the leftward swing in public opinion, they, and not only they, but also their Conservative colleagues, including the Prime Minister himself, still believed Britons would never vote against the man who had saved the country in 1940, or against his party. Ironically, Labour men did not realise that Churchill never even seriously considered calling a wartime general election, because he did not want to break up the coalition either. He considered a multi-party government essential until Germany surrendered. These complementary inhibitions set the limits to wartime ideological conflict over domestic issues, but the conflict never ceased, and in fact only grew fiercer as victory appeared more likely. Churchill, whose extraordinary qualities included great political savvy, defeated the threats to his leadership posed by Cripps and Beaverbrook. He did not defeat Morrison, but then Morrison never directly challenged his position as Prime Minister. And yet Morrison came to personify, more than Attlee, Bevan or even Cripps, a Fabian socialist movement that was about to reach its climax. The tide had been running left since 1940. Even Winston Churchill could not stem it, as the general election of 1945 would make painfully clear. Part 3. Sundering the War Cabinet. Chapter 12. Churchill on the downslope. Winston Churchill's wartime career does not describe a perfect arc, but rather a rough one. From the moment Neville Chamberlain brought him into the government in September 1939 until sometime after the crisis of the spring and summer of 1940, he experienced a breathtaking ascent. Churchill propelled and directed this upward movement, establishing himself not merely as Britain's Prime Minister, but as her indispensable man. Particularly during 1940 to 1941, he spoke in language as beautiful as Shakespeare's, what everyone wished that they could say. The nation recognized him as the embodiment of its will to survive. And so, despite the occasional hiccup, he reached the apex of the arc, probably on December 7, 1941, when he learned that America would enter the war against the Axis powers. From that great height, he could see at last a clear path to likely, if hard-fought and costly, victory. But an apex must be followed by a descent. With national survival no longer at stake, Churchill had to deal with parliamentary critics and rebellions. They were inconsequential at first, but increasingly threatening, or at least conceivably threatening. He had to fend off potential rivals for the leadership. His fierce concentration lapsed as well, and he experienced physical illness, the black dog of depression, and occasional bouts of lassitude and lachrymose self-pity. There still would be triumphs, and not small ones. He did not know he was on the downslope, nor did anyone else. At times, he and they must have thought the direction remained upward, but in fact, Winston Churchill was destined to plumb the depths in July 1945, only 2 months after Germany surrendered. He had wished to maintain the coalition after victory in Europe. He could not, and therefore had to call a general election. He entered the campaign supremely confident he would triumph. Everyone agreed with him. Even his opponents thought he would win. But the voters turned his party out, giving an enormous parliamentary majority to Labour instead. It was Winston Churchill's turn to relinquish the seals of office. Shocked beyond measure, he entitled the last volume of his memoir of the war years, Triumph and Tragedy. There had been warning signs, but he had missed them. Churchill had no inkling of the wretched denouement to his wartime premiership when on Monday morning, May 15, 1944, he and his old friend Jan Smuts, Prime Minister of South Africa, King George VI, and accompanied by the Chiefs of Staff, various top British and American military personnel, and the entire War Cabinet, assembled in a room at St. Paul's School in Barnes, West London, right at a sharp bend in the River Thames. The school served at that time as a London headquarters of General Bernard Montgomery. Students, faculty and staff had evacuated it at the start of the war. At the front of the room, in which the group gathered, stood a stage, and on that stage stood a great map of the Normandy beaches, tilted at an angle so that everyone could see and understand its geography. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, now the supreme Allied commander in Europe, mounted the stage with pointer in hand. The august assemblage sat in rows of seats before him. Then the American military chief announced what everyone had come to hear. Operation Overlord, the long-awaited Allied assault upon France, the one that would open the second front for which the Russians in particular had long been calling, would commence in 3 weeks, weather permitting. During the interval between the briefing and the invasion, the War Cabinet spun its wheels. On May 22, the Foreign Office official Alexander Cadogan wrote in his diary, "Cabinet, 5:30. Put off till 6, because nothing on agenda." But the shorter the agenda, the longer the ramble, and they hadn't finished when I left at 7:50. 8 days later he wrote, "5:30 Cabinet. As usual, put off till 6:30, as there was nothing on agenda. We rambled incoherently till 8:45. Winston Churchill had never been good at running meetings. He harangued, speculated, pontificated. He preferred his own voice and thoughts to those of any other man or woman. The pending operation on the continent exacerbated his indiscipline. "Oh, for Neville Chamberlain on these occasions," lamented Cadogan, who recalled the late former Prime Minister as an admirable chairman, at any rate. During this period, Churchill could not disguise his nerves. The commander of the Imperial General Staff, Alan Brooke, judged him to be in a very highly strung condition. And why not? Alan Brooke himself admitted to being at this time really torn to shreds with doubts and misgivings, and he oversaw only military matters. Churchill had to take not only the military realm, but also the political into account. If Operation Overlord failed, the Allies would not lose the war, but they would suffer a grievous setback. Morale would plummet among the war-weary people of Britain. It would plummet in the United States too, which could affect FDR's prospects in the pending presidential election. There would also be great disillusionment in Russia. Stalin might consider making a separate peace with Hitler, who would be feeling a new lease on life. Churchill, the War Cabinet, the generals, indeed everyone, had been straining for 4 years to make Operation Overlord possible. Now that it was in the offing, it must not fail. The tension had an effect, and not only in poorly run and unproductive meetings. Churchill's colleagues sprinkled their diaries with references to his furious diatribes and rages during these weeks. He could not abide the French leader, Charles de Gaulle, and did not hide it. He savaged the ministers who opposed him about de Gaulle, or about anything. Restless, anxious, but also characteristically mischievous and bold, he wanted to be present when the landings in France took place. He overrode the inevitable opposition of his generals and cabinet colleagues. It took the king, finally, to dissuade him from this crazy venture. Underlying everything must have been his apprehension of the carnage to come, especially if Operation Overlord did not unfold as planned. On the eve of D-Day, June 5, just before midnight, he paced the underground map room of the annex to Number 10. He knew that the first Allied soldiers were about to begin gliding and parachuting into Normandy. He said to his wife Clementine, "Do you realize that by the time you wake up in the morning, 20,000 men may have been killed?" When he went to bed that night, only a few in Britain knew precisely what was in the offing. 10 hours later, everyone knew. On the 9 a.m. broadcast, the BBC announcer quoted the German overseas news. "Early this morning, the expected Anglo-American invasion began when airborne forces were landed in the Seine estuary." At the House of Commons, MPs waited in an agony of suspense for the Prime Minister to provide more information. He arrived, Harold Nicholson wrote in his diary, at 3 minutes before noon, white as a sheet. First he reported on the Allied campaign in Italy, which was going well. The troops of American General Mark Clark and British General Harold Alexander had liberated Rome. The House cheered. It was welcome news, but not what members had come to hear. Then Churchill gave it to them. "I have also to announce to the House that during the night and the early hours of this morning, the first series of landings in force upon the European continent has taken place. The fire of the shore batteries has been largely quelled. The obstacles that were constructed in the sea have not proved so difficult. Everything is proceeding according to plan. Thankfully, the Allies did not suffer 20,000 dead on D-Day, as Churchill had feared they might, but rather about 3,000. Churchill went from nerve-wracking tension to high spirits and boundless optimism. He stood upon an uptick of an arc. That arc, however, otherwise generally pointed down. On June 10, he and Brooke and Smuts, who was not merely an old friend and colleague, but also the only politician whom he both trusted and considered to be his equal, crossed the Channel in a British destroyer to lunch with General Montgomery, who had relocated his headquarters from St. Paul's School to a chateau in Normandy. He toured Britain's limited bridgehead on the continent. Returning to England aboard the destroyer Kelvin and watching the shore recede, and imagining the German troops only a few miles inland, he suggested to the captain, "Since we are so near, why shouldn't we have a plug at them ourselves before we go home?" The captain obliged, and in a minute or two all our guns fired on the silent coast. Then the destroyer turned about and aimed for England, at speed. That was a triumphant, buoyant, and audacious side of the story. Churchill exulting in a great military victory, and directing potshots at the enemy himself. There was another side, domestic and political, that did not bode so well for the Prime Minister, however. Perhaps because of his high spirits, he chose to ignore it, or did not even see it. But then, very few did. He had agreed reluctantly to bring over from Algiers his bête noire, Charles de Gaulle, on June 4, only 2 days before D-Day, to inform him of the pending operation. The two men would meet in Churchill's special train in Droxford, near Portsmouth. The British Prime Minister would be accompanied once again by Smuts, and also by the rough diamond, Ernest Bevin, for whom he had developed considerable, if wary, respect. Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden would motor over from his country house to join them. On the appointed day, the Foreign Secretary arrived early enough to walk with de Gaulle down the railway line toward Churchill's train. The Prime Minister, moved by his sense of history, was on the track to greet the General with arms outstretched, Eden recalled. The French leader, formal and stiff, did not respond, and the ensuing meeting did not go well. But it is a brief exchange that took place afterward, between the supporting cast members, and not the principals, that is revealing for the state of the coalition government. With Churchill otherwise occupied, Bevin and Eden found a moment to consult. Perhaps they stood on the track, perhaps in a corridor of the railway carriage, one man trim and elegant, the descendant of a long line of baronets, the other rough-hewn and bulky, the son of an agricultural labourer who had deserted him and his mother. At this critical moment of the world conflict, these two crucial, ill-assorted, and yet mutually respectful ministers at war did not speak of de Gaulle or of relations with France, or even of Operation Overlord, which they and their colleagues had been dreaming of and planning for years. Rather, they spoke of politics. Bevin told Eden he thought a coalition should continue to govern Britain after the war. Eden agreed. Bevin wondered whether the old man would want to lead it. Eden did not know. If Churchill stepped aside, Bevin averred he himself would not care which office either of us held. Eden replied, "Neither would I." Bevin stipulated only one condition: nationalization of the coal mines. Eden agreed to it. It sounds as if the two men were dividing between them the top positions of a post-Churchill coalition government and deciding upon its first domestic priority. A few minutes later, Smuts, who had noticed the brief colloquy, asked Eden what it had been about. When Eden told him, Smuts merely remarked, referring to Bevin's price for continuing to work with the Conservative, cheap at the price. It is worth noting, when a Prime Minister's closest colleagues whisper behind his back about future arrangements in which he will not be included, even if the arrangements come to nothing. Here is one piece of the evidence Churchill did not see, or chose to ignore: that men could now imagine a post-war government in which he did not figure. It was a sure indication that despite Britain's improving military situation, he was on the downslope of the arc. The odd thing is that, despite their little conference, Eden and Bevan did not see it either. They stood together in Droxford, not quite conspiring against their leader, but at least drawing castles in the air. Neither of them wanted Churchill to stay on. They thought he had seen his best days. But at the same time, neither of them thought Churchill could be denied the premiership after the war if he still wanted it, and at this point both were prepared to serve under him if he did want it. Ironically, this attitude may have been harder for Eden, the Conservative, to bear than for Bevan, the Socialist. As long ago as September 1940, Churchill had promised to step aside in Eden's favour once Britain's enemies had been defeated. As he had said on more than one occasion, he would be an old man then. And he had written a famous letter to the King in February 1942 advising him to appoint Eden as Prime Minister in case of his death. Still, it is not clear that Churchill ever seriously thought that victory in war should signal an end to his premiership, and the closer to victory Britain drew, the less attractive such a prospect seemed. By 1945 he thought, as he wrote in his memoir, "I had the world position as a whole in my mind, and I deemed myself to possess knowledge, influence, and even authority which might be of service. I therefore saw it as my duty to try, to continue as Prime Minister, and at the same time as my right. I could not believe this would be denied me." Eden could only grind his teeth and vent his frustration in his diary, although even here he did not write straightforwardly that he longed for the top job, although surely he did, but merely that, with regard to Churchill, "there is certainly deterioration," a judgment confirmed by many other diarists. Churchill could not run meetings. He drank to excess. He would often browbeat his colleagues. Yet none of them, whether Conservative, Liberal or Labour, believed there really would be a post-war government led by anyone else. Even British voters, who soon would cast their ballots in record numbers against Churchill's party, assumed that Churchill would be Britain's Prime Minister when the war was over. Practically no one grasped where on the curve Winston Churchill now truly stood. Once he decided not to step aside at the end of the war, Churchill hoped to become Prime Minister of a post-war coalition government, not a Conservative one. He was in tune with Eden and Bevan to this extent. He told Smuts that, for all their sniping and rivalry, his War Cabinet colleagues constituted the most capable government England has had or is likely to have. A normal general election would break it up. Churchill conceived an expedient, a general election, and then a new coalition to reflect the new balance of power in the House. It did not occur to him that he would not be its Prime Minister. Churchill still distrusted, disliked and disagreed with many Conservatives, who returned the favour. Now that Chamberlain, Halifax and Kingsley Wood were gone, he had not a single orthodox senior Conservative colleague in the War Cabinet, although he did have several unorthodox ones. He did not identify with a single political party either, but rather with two, primarily with the Conservatives, to which he belonged, but also, and to a lesser extent, and as perhaps his 4-year plan had indicated, with the Liberals, to which he once had belonged. During the general election campaign of 1945 he would say, "I am as much a Liberal as I am a Tory." Not surprisingly, when he proposed that plan back in 1943, he had made a prediction. It will have to be presented to the country, either by a national government formally representative as this one is of the three parties in the state, or by a national government comprising the best men in all parties who are willing to serve. He knew that although many rank-and-file Conservatives might prefer a return to party politics, they would go along with him on the new coalition idea. They would never cross the man who won the war. He was their side's greatest electoral asset. Churchill thought Labour would go along too, for the opposite reason. Its leaders remembered that David Lloyd George, who had also won a world war, had called a snapped khaki election in 1918. Lloyd George, who had led the section of the Liberal Party that did not remain loyal to Asquith, the man he had replaced as Prime Minister, consulted with his Conservative partner in the wartime coalition government, Andrew Bonar Law, as to which candidate should receive a coupon, the imprimatur of their support. Then they scored a landslide victory, wiping out Asquith's couponless followers. It spelled the end of the Liberal Party as a major force in Britain. Labour Party leaders feared that if Churchill called a khaki election and bestowed his own coupons at the end of World War II, he might destroy their party also, or at any rate damage it badly. Churchill would have been pleased, had he known, that in September 1943, Morrison and Minister of Economic Warfare Hugh Dalton spoke to Lord Halifax, who was visiting in England again from the United States, about the importance of having a national government continuing after the war, and that a few days earlier Dalton had put the same point to Attlee, who had agreed with it. Bevan came to it as well, as he indicated to Eden. In the autumn of 1943, all of them reasoned, as Churchill suspected they must, better half a loaf, gained through continuing the coalition under Churchill, than no loaf at all. In the end, however, Labour's leaders changed their minds. They felt pressure from an energised and expanding left. The Communists and the new body, Commonwealth, and Labour's own left wing would not be satisfied with merely half a loaf. If that was all Labour offered, then all three might make common cause in demanding more. Labour's leaders fainted right. They did try to appeal to the middle class, or as Morrison called them, employing old Fabian terms, workers by hand as well as brain, the blackcoats. But they moved more decisively to the left, seeking to co-opt, to channel and to satisfy, at least partially, the militants. Morrison embarked upon his series of speeches about the need for post-war controls. He and Attlee and Bevan pushed the need for decisions on a reluctant war cabinet. They called for, and the war cabinet accepted, with more or less reluctance, various Keynesian measures of demand management, including some post-war controls detailed most notably in a white paper on full employment published in 1944. During the general election campaign a year later, Labour's leaders would claim that, but for their efforts, the government never would have recommended such an approach. They did enough to assuage the Labour left and Commonwealth, as the election results would demonstrate, while limiting the appeal of the even more militant Communists. But partly as a result of their actions, party divisions within Churchill's coalition grew wider, not narrower, as the war drew to a close, and the prospects of a second coalition dimmed. Despite having favoured it to begin with, in the end, Labour's leaders turned decisively against the idea of a post-war coalition. In August 1944, Attlee told a special committee of his party's National Executive Committee that he believed a moment will come when the PM will say to me that he hopes, having gone through the war in Europe together, we can go on together through a general election on an agreed programme. I would then reply that I am afraid that this is impossible, and that when the general election comes, and we should do nothing to hasten it, we must offer the country the choice between two alternative programmes. Other party leaders made similar statements. Winston Churchill's fondest hopes notwithstanding, they had numbered the Grand Coalition's days, and begun to count them down. In this sense, Labour forced the general election of 1945, which it did not even think it could win, upon a reluctant Winston Churchill. The leaders preferred outright opposition and a united Labour Party to a new coalition, and Labour divided. But they could not force its timing, although they had a preference. They judged, as Attlee had indicated in August 1944, that the later the general election took place, the better it would be for them. They wanted an interval between the German surrender and the vote, during which Churchill's prestige might deflate somewhat. Churchill's PPS put it this way: The greater the delay, the more time they have to spread their poison in an endeavour to discredit you. In addition, they favoured delay because they wanted an up-to-date electoral register. The old one might disenfranchise Labour voters, who probably had been more peripatetic during the war than Conservatives. The general election should not take place until the new register, now in preparation, had been completed. Conservatives, in contrast, preferred speed, not delay, if a general election must come, and not merely to take advantage of electoral rolls that might favour them. Whereas Labour hoped time would diminish Churchill's popularity, Conservatives hoped to cash in on it before that could happen. The general opinion was in favour of an early election. The same PPS reported to Churchill in April 1945, after monitoring discussion on the subject by Conservative House members. A meeting of Conservative election agents took an identical line, as the party chairman recounted. There were only one or two who thought that advantage would be gained by postponing until the autumn. The Prime Minister took the temperature of his senior non-Labour and non-Liberal party colleagues. Almost unanimously, they favoured continuing the coalition until Japan had been defeated, and calling a general election at that point. But if Labour should demur, then, as Woolton put it, demand election at earliest. One Conservative cabinet minister, the acute R.A. Butler, objected. Unless our tactical position vis-à-vis the Socialists is stronger than it seems at the moment, I would prefer an October election. No one paid attention to him. In any case, the matter must wait upon military events. No one proposed holding a general election before Germany surrendered. In the fall of 1944, Hitler had loosed upon Britain the V-2 rockets. With enemy forces closing in on Germany from all directions, he ordered desperate counterattacks both east and west, all of them ultimately futile. The loss of life was tremendous for both sides. By February 1945, the Western Allies had entered the Rhineland. By late March, they had crossed the Rhine and headed into Germany proper, millions of them. From the other side, Russian troops entered Warsaw in early January, and to the south they poured into Austria at the very end of March. Finally, they too, in their millions, pressed onward into Germany. By April 24, Russian forces had encircled Berlin. On April 30, as they approached his bunker amid fierce fighting, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. Germany surrendered a week later. Again, Churchill rode the crest of a wave. On May 8, he drove through streets teeming with joyful crowds to Buckingham Palace for lunch with the King. Then he went back to Downing Street and addressed the nation over the radio. After gallant France had been struck down, we from this island and from our united empire maintained the struggle single-handed for a whole year, until we were joined by the military might of Soviet Russia, and later by the overwhelming power and resources of the United States of America. Finally, almost the whole world was combined against the evildoers, who are now prostrate before us. Only Japan still resisted, and she could not hold out long. Churchill, who had knowledge of research on the atom bomb, did not mention it. "Advance Britannia," he concluded this radio address, his voice breaking. "Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King." From Downing Street, he travelled the short distance to the House of Commons in an open car. The delighted crowds, ever growing, nearly blocked his path. It took him more than half an hour to cover the several hundred yards from door to door. When finally he made it to the debating chamber, wrote Harold Nicholson to his son, the House rose as a man, and yelled and waved their order papers. Churchill repeated the speech he had just delivered on the radio. He addressed further multitudes later in the afternoon from a balcony of the Ministry of Health building, overlooking Whitehall. And after dinner, with the throngs undiminished, he spoke from another balcony above Parliament Street, where, according to the newspaper magnate and proprietor of the Telegraph, Lord Camrose, the crowd roared and roared again. Then it broke into song, "Land of Hope and Glory," and "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow," "Downslope of the Ark," Every appearance suggested the contrary, and not only to him. Churchill could be forgiven for thinking he would win any British election. With Labour refusing to commit to the coalition, why then continue to postpone the contest? In late April, Churchill had sent Eden and Attlee as Britain's chief representatives to the founding conference of the United Nations in San Francisco. That meant that when Germany surrendered, Morrison and Bevan had to speak for Labour back at home. Sometime during May 8 to 10, Labour's worst-matched pair met to hash out the position, but really they knew it already, and for once they agreed about it. The left, and not only the left, but also the solid centre of their party, were clamouring for a return to politics as usual. The mass of Labour supporters relished the prospect of confrontation with the Conservatives now. To ignore this sentiment would be to risk splitting the leaders from the rank and file, perhaps driving a significant number into the arms of Commonwealth or the Communists. The coalition must be wound up. It had been brought into being at a desperate moment to save Britain. That it had done. For reasons already explained, Bevan and Morrison hoped the winding up would take place later rather than sooner. But the need for another decision, this one about when a general election should take place, was obvious to them. On May 11, at 12:30 p.m., the two entered 10 Downing Street to put this to Winston Churchill. He didn't like the idea of breaking up the government, but he did not fear doing so, if necessary either. Morrison reported to Attlee that he warned the Prime Minister that the present register is in a bad way, and that this and other imperfections must be faced by him. Accordingly, he pushed for an autumn poll. Bevan backed him. Churchill did not commit to any date, but he realised he must choose soon. "I have not finally settled between June and October," he telegrammed to Eden in San Francisco immediately after the meeting. "But a decision must be made within the next 3 or 4 days." It took a little longer than that, and there would be a few twists and turns. Attlee rushed back to England on May 16. Churchill met him on the night of his return, and then again the following day. Did the Labour Party leader remember the meetings 5 years before in the same room at Downing Street, when he had told Chamberlain that Labour never would serve under him? How could he not? But Attlee did not think the present circumstances comparable. He did not realise that he still held the advantage. He thought Churchill did, because Churchill would soon be the man who won the war, just as Lloyd George had been in 1918. Therefore, when the Prime Minister ruled out the autumn election on a date he knew Attlee favoured, and suggested instead, as his Conservative colleagues had recommended, the stark alternative of either a spring election or an election after Japan had surrendered, whenever that might be, Attlee did not demur, but merely promised to take it up with his senior colleagues. Attlee met with those colleagues on the following morning, May 18. Dalton and Bevan agreed with Attlee that the prospect of a spring election was too dangerous. Labour had no option but to go on with the coalition until the defeat of Japan, as Churchill suggested, soothing the left as best it could, and preparing for a general election all the while. Morrison, however, disagreed emphatically. He did not want to wait for the Japanese surrender, which he assumed might not occur for years. He had no knowledge of the atom bomb research, and he predicted that the party as a whole would not want to wait either. Attlee proposed a compromise. Labour would stay in the coalition, as Churchill wanted, but only if the Prime Minister promised to speedily implement the proposals for social security and full employment outlined in earlier white papers. It was like framing the need for decisions memo again. Perhaps he alone, perhaps he and the other 3, worked out on paper the language the Prime Minister must accept if Labour was to stay until victory in the Far East had been won. As it happened, the Labour Party was about to convene its annual conference at Blackpool in northwestern England, just as in 1940, when the negotiations with Chamberlain had been taking place. It had been meeting at Bournemouth. Once Attlee had his paper, Bevan, Dalton and Morrison entrained for the conference. Attlee returned to 10 Downing Street for a final session with the Prime Minister, document in hand. Churchill read and accepted it immediately. He thought that in return for promising to implement Social Security and full employment, Attlee had promised to persuade Labour to stay in until the defeat of Japan. "I certainly had the impression when he left that he would do his best to keep us together," Churchill later wrote. Attlee, for his part, believed, as he left for Blackpool, that in return for Labour's continuing participation in the coalition, Churchill would implement the proposed reforms and then call an election sometime in the autumn. He did not tie this to the defeat of Japan. His understanding of the agreement and Churchill's were mutually exclusive. At Blackpool, Attlee put the case as he understood it. But first, the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party voted against delaying the election until autumn, and then, on May 21, so did the conference as a whole. The majority could not wait to get to grips with the Conservatives. Even Bevan and Dalton swung round to that position, and finally Attlee accepted it as well. With Morrison's help, he composed a letter to Churchill reflecting the more militant view. "It is precisely on the problems of the reconstruction of the economic life of the country that party differences are most acute. What is required is decisive action. This can only be forthcoming from a government united on principle and policy." Again, it was an odd echo of the events of 1940. Just as Attlee had telephoned Chamberlain with Labour's decision before delivering the letter saying his party would not serve under him, so now he telephoned Churchill to say pretty much the same thing. Churchill regretted it. He blamed Morrison for forcing the issue. He thought Attlee had betrayed him. He wrote to the Labour Party leader, "I have concerned myself solely with trying to create tolerable conditions under which we could work together. It is clear from the tone of your letter and the feelings of your party that these no longer exist." But it never occurred to him that he was on a slippery slope headed downhill. He simply did not recognize the weight of public opinion in favor of the reforms advocated by the left. On May 23, 1945, with regret, no doubt, but also with supreme confidence, he submitted his resignation to the King, who immediately charged him with forming an interim caretaker government to rule until a general election should take place. Churchill selected from the previous administration leading Conservatives such as Eden, Beaverbrook and Littleton, current Minister of Production. Several representatives of the rising generation of Conservatives, such as Butler and Harold Macmillan, and the non-party men, Anderson and Woolton. Amazingly, he invited Cripps, who had not yet returned to the Labour Party, to join too. "I can't do that, much as I admire the old man. We do not think alike," Cripps reported afterward to Eden and Lord Cranborne, whom he came upon standing outside the door to the Cabinet Room at number 10, just as he was exiting. Then a faint echo of earlier hopes for a coalition sans the great advocate of coalitions. Cripps whispered to the two Conservatives, "It might have been different if it had been Anthony who'd asked me." Churchill advised the King to dissolve Parliament on June 15. Polling day would take place 3 weeks later, on July 5, with a few local variations. The counting of ballots would begin on July 26. This second 3-week interval would permit time for the votes of overseas soldiers to be transported home. To the chagrin of Labour Party leaders, but to the delight of their own rank and file, and also to the delight of most Conservatives, Churchill had called a snapped khaki election after all. Still, he was sentimental about his erstwhile colleagues. "We had been through so much together," he wrote in his memoir. On May 28, he invited former government ministers to an at-home at number 10, in the Cabinet Room where they had so often met. The cabinet table around which they were accustomed to sit had been draped to serve as a buffet. Practically all the former Labour ministers, as well as most of the Tories and Liberals and non-party men, more than 40 individuals in all, gathered around it. The temper was friendly, but electric, Churchill would recall. His guests would have stood, with drinks and canapes in hand, when he came before the table to address them, tears streaming down his cheeks. Recent events notwithstanding, Churchill referred to Attlee as his good friend. But they were all friends. He said, Hugh Dalton recorded in his diary, that we had all come together and had stayed together as a united band of friends in a very trying time. History would recognize this. Recording the Prime Minister's exact words, Dalton wrote, "The light will shine on every helmet," and his own reaction to them, "I feel the moment a bit too." Perhaps he was remembering the day in 1940 when in the same room Churchill had explained to him and others how desperate Britain's plight was, and yet how utterly determined he was to fight on. Two important Conservatives did not attend this emotional gathering, however. The previous evening, Lord Beaverbrook had hosted a small party at his country house in Surrey. After an excellent dinner with a magnum of champagne and lots of brandy, the group had settled in for a long political conversation. The evening was fun, with a real buccaneering, racketeering atmosphere, wrote one who took part. The gossip swirled. Snide comments ruled. Bevan, Eden and Anderson came in for particular abuse. Charming, clever Brendan Bracken, the Churchill acolyte, and irascible, incorrigible Lord Beaverbrook, Churchill's intimate, set the tone and dominated. The guest who wrote in his diary about it afterward predicted, more presciently perhaps than he could have known, that, of course they, Beaverbrook and Bracken, will do the Conservative Party countless harm at this election and afterwards. The next day, Beaverbrook bid farewell to his overnight guests. He would stay in the country, and so would miss Churchill's at home that afternoon. Bracken motored up to London, but he did not attend the event at Downing Street either. Those two had little time for sentiment, but plenty for politics. I am anxious to drive, and intending to display restless activity until after the election is over, Beaverbrook had warned the Conservative Chief Whip a few months earlier. Bracken had similar intentions. Chapter 13. Aftershock. They were no longer a band of friends. It seems fair to ask whether they ever truly had been. So acrimonious did the general election campaign of 1945 become. Perhaps the pent-up emotions loosed after victory over Germany promoted ill temper during the political contest that immediately followed. Certainly Beaverbrook, and perhaps Bracken, had something to do with the ugly tone. And certainly Churchill felt let down by his former Labour and Liberal partners, whom he thought had deserted him and was determined to pay them back. He had offered his tribute to them during the at-home at No. 10, but the party was over now, and he always had been a tough and exuberant campaigner. He was mostly consensual, wrote one in a position to know, but when he was partisan, he was very, very partisan. During the campaign of 1945, Churchill went out on the stump and let off fireworks. So did many former members of his war cabinet, from all parties. So, for that matter, did some of the audiences, literally. Churchill's first radio broadcast set the tone. He prepared it over the weekend of June 1 to 3 and delivered it Monday evening from a little room at Chequers hung with small paintings by the quintessential English landscape artist John Constable. As he spoke into the microphone, he gestured more broadly than he did in conversation, as if he were addressing a large audience. He chopped at the air with his hands, chopping at Labour too. Its members had been for some time eager to set out upon the political warpath, and when large numbers of people feel like that it is not good for their health to deny them the fight they want. "We will therefore give it to them," he said. Evidently, he had been reading Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom. "My friends, I must tell you that a socialist policy is abhorrent to the British ideas of freedom. Socialism is an attack upon the right of an ordinary man or woman to breathe freely without having a harsh, clumsy, tyrannical hand clapped across their mouths and nostrils. No socialist government conducting the entire life and industry of the country could afford to allow free, sharp, or violently worded expressions of public discontent. They would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo. This last word he pronounced with a soft G, perhaps to make it sound more sinister. It was a disastrous overture to the campaign, by common consent a strategic blunder, as Butler would later call it. Many knew that Labour's leaders had denounced the Gestapo before Conservative Party leaders did. After all, the Gestapo had first gone after their comrades in the German Labour and Socialist movements, as well as the Jews. Everyone knew that during the war many Labour supporters had sacrificed their lives defending British ideas of freedom. Everyone also knew that for the past 5 years, Churchill had worked with, and often praised, the very men he now claimed would impose dictatorship over the country. Churchill's wife Clementine, who was more politically sensitive at this moment than he was, begged him to take out the reference to the Gestapo before he gave the speech. He would not. It fell to Clement Attlee, leader of the Labour Party, to make the first public reply to this ill-judged broadside. Churchill is supposed to have once said of Attlee that he was a modest man, with much to be modest about. It was a serious underestimation, if he ever made it. Churchill denied that he did. Attlee could never be discounted. His reply to Churchill's accusations, also delivered on the radio, was devastating. When I listened to the Prime Minister's speech last night, in which he gave such a travesty of the policy of the Labour Party, I realised at once what was his object. He wanted the electors to understand how great was the difference between Winston Churchill, the great leader in war of a united nation, and Mr. Churchill, the party leader of the Conservatives. He feared lest those who had accepted his leadership in war might be tempted out of gratitude to follow him further. I thank him for having disillusioned them so thoroughly. The voice we heard last night was that of Mr. Churchill, but the mind was that of Lord Beaverbrook. Thus the modest man unhesitatingly picked up the gauntlet thrown down by a great man. During 1940 to 1945, Attlee had never conspired against Churchill. He had held aloof from Cripps when the latter dreamed of a centrist triumvirate to replace the Prime Minister. He had no time for Beaverbrook when the Canadian fantasized briefly about ascending to the throne. Indeed, he disliked Beaverbrook, with whom he had clashed often and openly, especially over Russia, and he distrusted Beaverbrook's influence over Churchill, an influence he thought the recent radio broadcasts demonstrated. Unlike many of his colleagues, Attlee did not gossip or scheme. He had always acted as a loyal and helpful colleague to the Prime Minister, although he was of course forever aware of, and within limits, working for the interests of his own party. One imagines that he would have been a respectful, if tough-minded rival in a different sort of election campaign, and that Churchill might very well have outshone and even outbid him. Instead, voters came to perceive Clement Attlee as Churchill's attractive antithesis: unflappable, unemotional, sensible, moderate, tolerant. They perceived his strengths. Unwittingly, Churchill had promoted a man who otherwise might have struggled to find the limelight. Then Churchill committed a second blunder. Again, he could have played it very differently, and much more to his benefit. He announced his intention to go to Potsdam following the campaign to meet Stalin and Harry Truman, who had succeeded President Franklin Roosevelt after the latter's death on April 12. There the Allied leaders would determine how to punish defeated Germany. Churchill wanted to present a united front to the foreigners, and so he issued an invitation to the leader of the Labour Party to join him. Did it strike him as an odd invitation to make, given that he had just said Attlee would rule England with Gestapo methods if his party won the general election? Did the invitation suggest to voters that his initial charges had been merely rhetorical, and perhaps even insincere? In any event, when the political scientist Harold Lasky, a professor at the London School of Economics, and long-time left-wing Labour Party apparatchik, learned of the invitation, he made what he may have thought was an innocuous statement. Mr. Attlee can hardly accept responsibility for agreements which will have been concluded by Mr. Churchill as Prime Minister. Lasky thought that the Labour Party leader should attend the Potsdam meeting as an observer only, for if Labour won the general election, it would naturally pursue a different foreign policy than Churchill would. The professor may too have thought that Attlee needed this kind of prodding, and that he had agreed too readily with Churchill's foreign policies, for he repeated the assertion several times in other public speeches. Lasky occupied the position of Labour Party chairman, a post given annually to the member of the National Executive Committee, NEC, with the most years of service who had never held it before. Churchill seized on the opening he thought Lasky provided him, who, he asked in a letter addressed to Attlee, but also delivered to the press for maximum publicity, determined Labour policy, the elected party leader, or the unelected party chairman, assisted by the unelected NEC. Lasky had provided further evidence, the Prime Minister charged, of Labour's undemocratic basis and distrust of British-style freedom. A lengthy public correspondence ensued. Attlee insisted in a series of sharply worded yet pithy letters on Lasky's limited role and influence. Churchill harped upon the professor's sinister aims and authority. Important Conservatives followed their leader. Oliver Littleton, whose duties as Minister of Production in the caretaker government Churchill had augmented by appointing President of the Board of Trade as well, referred to Lasky and the rest of Labour's NEC as a hidden and unelected camarilla in the background. Oliver Stanley, Secretary of State for the Colonies, predicted that at the Big Three conference, Truman would represent America, Stalin would represent Russia, and in the event of a socialist government being returned here, Attlee would represent Professor Lasky. Richard Law, a junior minister and son of a prime minister, charged that the socialists were proposing to do away with the control of Parliament and substitute for it the dictatorship of the Socialist Grand Council. That, Law added, had a familiar and an ominous ring to it. But so did some of the Conservative rhetoric about Lasky. The Prime Minister seemed to be suggesting that a man whose name did not sound English was actually Labour's sinister puppet master. Beaverbrook went further. In a speech at Streatham he referred to the secret protocols of Lasky's NEC, probably an unintentional evocation of the infamous Russian anti-Semitic fabrication, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. He then hereby declared that Lasky is aiming at the destruction of the parliamentary system of Great Britain. Lord Croft, an Under-Secretary in the War Office, went beyond even this. He sneeringly termed Lasky that fine old English Labour man. Churchill, perhaps knowing that when Lord Croft's daughter married a German Jewish refugee, Croft had said she was committing social suicide, wrote to him, "Pray be careful, whatever the temptation, not to be drawn into any campaign that might be represented as anti-Semitism." No doubt the man who had led a crusade on behalf of all peoples against Nazi hypernationalism regretted having opened the door to such representations, but he had cause to regret the entire campaign directed against Harold Lasky. There is no evidence that it resonated with voters. To the contrary, as one eminent figure has written, the vast majority of the public did not understand what Churchill was on about. He would have done much better to have appeared magnanimous, offering the invitation to Attlee and letting it go at that, not least because Labour's leader had no intention of letting Lasky or anyone else pull his strings. Probably Churchill would have done better to have never mentioned Lasky at all. There is a pathetic side to the episode as well. Lasky was a distinguished scholar and a visible presence on the left wing of the Labour Party, but he suffered from delusions of grandeur, often claiming influence he did not have. He peppered important figures, both inside the Labour movement and outside it, with one letter after another, in handwriting so tiny that it was difficult to read. He peppered Winston Churchill too, presuming on a slight connection that the latter had established at the outset of his parliamentary career with Lasky's father, an influential figure in the Manchester Jewish community, which Churchill then was courting for votes. Just before the Labour Party's annual conference in Blackpool, Lasky had written to tell Churchill that he would be its acting chairman. May I say that whatever remarks I may make in this official capacity are only relevant in a Pickwickian sense to a man for whom, party aside, I have an inherited affectionate respect. If he was trying to play upon what he supposed to be a family connection, and thereby to head off in advance attacks that Churchill might aim at him in his new exalted position, it was a doomed effort, and a naive one. A veteran of the unforgiving world of rough politics, Churchill would never permit an appeal of this nature to sway him. Lasky wrote to Churchill again at the outset of the general election campaign, and before the brouhaha over Attlee's role at Potsdam. My colleagues who served with you in the recent coalition have asked me to tell you that whatever the political differences, the personal respect and affection remain unimpaired. I hope you will allow the chairman of the Labour Party strongly to associate himself with this view. Churchill did not reply, but sent a note to his private office. I do not know on what official grounds Mr. Lasky writes to me. I have no personal relations with him. This note surely would have mortified the professor, had he known of it. One is left with the impression that Lasky hoped for, and may even have expected, a special dispensation, immunity from the hard knocks of politics, based upon a link with Churchill that existed only in his mind. Instead, he became the conservative bête noire of the campaign, and brought the roof down on his own head. Two parties fought for victory during the general election campaign of 1945, Conservative and Labour. The Liberals did not count. They put up 306 candidates, which gave them no chance at a majority in a parliament of 640. With much fanfare, they managed to enlist William Beveridge, who had declined to join the Labour Party. He proved a poor candidate and lost what had been considered a safe Liberal seat. Archie Sinclair, the Liberal Air Force Service Minister, lost his seat too. In the end, voters returned only 12 Liberals to Parliament. Clem Davis, a chief organiser of the revolt against Chamberlain in 1940, would become leader of this post-war rump, a poor reward. As for the National Liberals, that vermiform appendix, as one old Liberal called them because she judged them useless, 11 of 49 emerged victorious from the general election, but only because they faced no Conservative opponent. Churchill wrote to a Conservative who had stepped aside for one of them. I thank you for your generous action. This is a form of putting country before party, for truly at this juncture the fortunes of the country do depend upon the shattering defeat of socialism. That was how Churchill hoped to frame the choice for electors. As an old political campaigner, you will realize the advantage of having socialists versus the rest, rather than Tories versus the rest, he wrote to an old friend and political ally. Conservatives hope to appeal to liberal and progressive-minded voters by promising to implement the 4-year plan that Churchill had adumbrated 2 years earlier, including national insurance, family allowances, education reform, and a national health service. They hope to appeal to the Conservative base by calling for an end to wartime controls. They thought they would appeal to everyone by demanding the triumphant return to office of Winston Churchill. They clung to his coattails and praised him to the skies. If not for him, Britain likely would have gone down to defeat in 1940, they trumpeted, expecting that he would be returned to power in 1945 for that reason alone. For its part, Labour stated forthrightly in its election manifesto that it was a socialist party and proud of it. It called for public ownership of the fuel and power industries, inland transport, and iron and steel production, Far from abolishing economic and price controls, Labour intended to maintain them in order to secure that first things shall come first and the transition from war to peace, and that every citizen shall get fair play. As for Winston Churchill, the human conservative trump card, Labour leaders knew better than to deny his greatness. But as Bevin noted in a speech, the war had not been a one-man business. We have contributed our share. British voters faced a stark choice with regard to domestic policy in 1945. On foreign affairs, the divide was not so clear. The leaders of both parties worried increasingly about Russia's plans for Eastern Europe, especially Poland. They both intended to maintain close links with America. They both hoped that some grouping of Commonwealth nations and colonies led by the United Kingdom would constitute a third power bloc economically and militarily, on a par or nearly so with the United States and the Soviet Union. Harold Laski was right to fear that Labour under Attlee would pursue a foreign policy much like Churchill's. In this regard, the hopes of the left in 1945, including the Labour left, for a socialist foreign policy, were doomed to disappointment. As for their attitudes about the British Empire, former War Cabinet ministers differed by degrees only, with the exception of Churchill, who was a conspicuous outlier on this subject. The majority of them, reflecting major opinion in the country as a whole, looked forward to more or less speedy independence for the remaining colonies, and then to a multiracial commonwealth of nations that would act as a unit in world affairs, in which Britain would be the first nation among equals. Churchill, however, opposed any reduction in the role or scope of the empire. He paid only lip service to the idea of independence for the colonies, which he deferred to an unmentioned future date. He opposed real independence, even for the Dominions, for as he told a gathering of Dominion and Indian representatives on April 3, 1945, independence and unity are the same thing, if you think the same way. He affected to believe that the men sitting around the table with him that day all thought the same way. Meanwhile, the ministers of Churchill's erstwhile Grand Coalition had fanned out across the country, urging their competing programs and taking potshots at their former colleagues. Churchill had set the tone in his initial radio address. In its aftermath, Conservatives referred to Gauleiter Lasky. The Daily Express equated the Labour Party with the Nazi Party in Germany and the Fascist Party in Italy. From the other side, the left-wing Tribune reminded readers that there are few Tory ministers whose pre-war record is not tainted by pro-Nazi sympathies. Tribune resurrected damning, indeed shocking articles written by one of Churchill's sons-in-law, Duncan Sandys, for the German Europäische Review in July and October 1936. Political meetings were raucous. The heckling was fierce. Leo Amery, Churchill's Secretary of State for India, spoke in Birmingham, where he had a stormy reception. This audiobook is continued on Disc 10.